So hello, everybody. Good evening, good morning, and good afternoon, depending on where you are. Now, my name is Masako Toki, a Senior Education Project Manager at the James Martin Center for Nonproliferation Studies. Thank you so much for joining the first Critical Issues Forum CIF Speakers Series. And I'm so happy to have Lovely Umayam as our first guest speaker for this year's CIF event. She will be introduced by our center's director, Dr. William Porter, shortly. I would also like to express our sincere appreciation to the funders of the CIF project, the Tom and Sarah Pattison Fund and the Saga Foundation. And Sarah is here with us, and thank you so much for your continuing support for the Critical Issues Forum and our center's education project. Okay. And what a great timing to have this hope-filled meeting with young people on the eve of the United Nations Day. So today we have participants from around the United States, Japan, and Russia. We have many new friends who just joined today's event. And we also have alumni of the CIF and also alumni of the CNS and the Middlebury Institute. So I'm so excited to see many friends. So I would like to briefly introduce the Critical Issues Forum to you. So Critical Issues Forum is one of the flagship programs at the James Martin Center for Nonproliferation Studies. CIF is an outreach program to promote disarmament and nonproliferation education among high school students around the world for a safer and more peaceful future. Currently, high schools from the United States, Japan, and Russia are participating in the program. CNS launched the CIF program in 1997, aiming to develop these young generations' critical thinking skills through nonproliferation and disarmament education. The program also promotes cross-cultural understanding and communication among participants. The current global pandemic has taught us the importance of further international cooperation in order to tackle the problem of nuclear threats. We believe that young people, such as high school students, have an important role to play in this seemingly insurmountable global crisis and to make progress toward a world free of nuclear weapons. Despite the global pandemic situation that requires us to conduct all the project activities virtually, we have not let it impede our efforts in promoting disarmament and nonproliferation education for young generation, future leaders. We continue to engage high school students in these important global issues. These are some photos from recent spring conferences. In normal years, the CIF project conducts an in-person student conference in Monterey, California, where our school is located. But in the past, we also had a conference in Hiroshima and Nagasaki in Japan and Vienna, Austria. And every year, CIF selects a timely topic related to nuclear disarmament and nonproliferation to study. Students present their semester-long studies at the spring conference. We also invite amazing guest speakers for the student conference, such as Dr. William Perry, former US Secretary of Defense, and Dr. Lassina Zerbo, Executive Secretary of the Comprehensive Nuclear Test Ban Treaty Organization. The important role that young people can play in nuclear disarmament has been more and more recognized. I'd like to quote United Nations Secretary General Antonio Guterres' statement in the Securing Our Common Future, an Agenda for Disarmament, that was issued in May 2018. We look to young people to the ultimate force for change at the local, national, and international levels to make the world safer and more secure for all. I believe that this is a direct message to all of you. Thank you for your attention. And for more information about the Critical Issues Forum, please visit our website and follow us on the social media. We have a Facebook page, Twitter account, Instagram, and YouTube channel. So now I would like to introduce one of the CIF alumna, Kimberly Nunez, to briefly share her experience in the CIF and her current activities and her future goals. Let me stop share. And okay, so Kimberly, so microphone is yours. So unmute and take it away.
Yeah. Hello, everyone. Just to briefly introduce myself, my name is Kimberly Nunez, and I went to Dr. Ogamohan High School in Los Angeles, California. I'm currently in DC because I'm an undergraduate student at Georgetown University, majoring in government and with a concentration in international affairs. So I was a part of the Critical Issues Forum in 2016, and it was such a long time ago. And I did my presentation on North Korea's nuclear program. And then the following year, I traveled to Nagasaki, Japan to further talk about nuclear nonproliferation with other CIF peers of mine. Although CIF was such a long time ago, the program has deeply impacted me as a student and exposed me to the importance of how essential it is for me to advocate for myself and for others. Especially being first generation and a low income student, having a role in critical discussions was very important to me, and CIF brought that for me. CIF gave me the platform to express my opinions, gave me the opportunity to advocate for change, be at the forefront of pressing conversations regarding international politics, and I made really great friendships throughout the way that I still keep in contact. Most importantly, because of CIF, I discovered my passion for public service, international politics, and student activism, which led me to my decision of Georgetown. So CIF formed a critical component to my decision. The program gave me a unique perspective about politics in the sense that it trained me to become a leader and an activist, which I channeled throughout my extracurriculars and my academics here in Georgetown and in the Washington, D.C. area. CIF gave me the courage and the confidence to get myself out there, meaning that once coming to Georgetown, I told myself that I will be involved in as many international relations activities, nuclear nonproliferation, as much as I can immerse myself in politics. Because of this promise I made to myself, I began to look for opportunities and I became more ambitious after CIF. Therefore, freshman year of college, I got to travel to Mumbai, India to learn about healthcare policy. I also became deeply involved in student government as a government major. I studied abroad in Italy to learn Italian. I was also a part of the US-China Student Fellowship Program at Georgetown to learn about diplomacy and foreign policy, which I was supposed to go to China, but because of the COVID-19 pandemic, I was unable to. Also, this came as a surprise to me, but this summer I was an intern for the William J. Perry Center in Washington, D.C., and I met Dr. Perry at CIF in 2016, so I was so thrilled to intern at the Perry Center. And currently I'm co-authoring a publication with one of the Perry Center professors about UN peacekeeping and women, peace, and security. I am still continuing my interest in nuclear disarmament. I did not want to lose it because I love nuclear nonproliferation. So for my major seminar, I will be writing a research report on nuclear nonproliferation and great power competition as my paper to culminate my major. Overall, CIF was a pivotal program that laid a foundation for my undergraduate career and helped me to discover my potential and how eager I am to make a change. This was really important for me because I felt like I had a platform to voice my opinions, and CIF was so pivotal in that. It definitely influenced me how I look at the world and challenged me to think of solutions for any political issue that I am passionate about, and especially nuclear disarmament. The program is so unique and offers so much for the youth to become involved. It makes you feel like you're a part of something, which is something I really enjoyed. For the future, although I am quite unsure what I wish to do post-grad, I am certain that I would like to be a policymaker and continue immersing myself in public service and international relations, and most importantly, nonproliferation. I hope to work abroad at some point to gain more international relations experience and continue my studies throughout grad school, or I'm taking an interest in law school as well too, so I'm not quite sure. The student I am today is definitely because of CIF. They exposed me to how important it is to voice myself and to be a leader in change. And I'd like to thank Masako, Mr. King, and my CIF peers for providing me a community and giving me the courage to always speak my mind.
Great, thank you so much, Kimberly. It was so inspiring and encouraging. Thank you.
Very inspirational to hear our young Georgetown student, Kimberly, talk about her experience. And I want to assure you that we have a slot reserved for you in Monterey, should you choose to pursue graduate school on the West Coast. And I think after you hear from our speaker today, maybe you'll be encouraged to do so. Let me just begin by saying it's a real pleasure to welcome you to this Critical Issues Forum event. I think at a time when the world is in really such a state of disarray, it's hard to find reasons for optimism, but I, for one, find that optimism when I think of our young students who are not only optimistic, but they're not cynical. They have a great deal of energy. They have enthusiasm. They're idealistic. And I think it's tremendously important to somehow tap that energy and idealism to try to repair our badly damaged world in this time of troubles. It wasn't that long ago, it seems to me at least, when I welcomed a young woman by the name of Lovely Umayam to Monterey as an incoming graduate student. She was really a very extraordinary student, especially adept in languages, kind of engaged in the issue of new tools and technologies, and also exceptionally creative. She also was very knowledgeable about the Nonproliferation Treaty and the NPT review process. And that proved to be very fortuitous because out of the blue, I received an invitation from a very senior Chilean diplomat, a good friend. I can mention his name, Alfredo Labe, who was at the time based in Vienna. And he said, because of the relationship that CNS was developing with the government of Chile, he would welcome my identifying a graduate student who could serve on the Chilean delegation. Not only serve on the Chilean delegation for the NPT process, but also to engage in deliberations with the non-aligned movement. And so it was a great offer. I didn't have to think too hard about who I wanted to select. And in fact, I chose Lovely to represent CNS on the Chilean delegation. But there was a very interesting moment at the beginning of that PrepCom that I suspect in Vienna that Lovely also remembers. I was actually with another delegation, the delegation of Kyrgyzstan as an advisor. And I remember early on, Lovely leaving her seat behind the Chilean placard, coming over to my Kyrgyz desk, and was very perplexed. And the problem was an unusual one. I think relatively few people at the at this PrepCom knew that Lovely was proficient in Chinese. Because of the alphabetical seating arrangement at the NPT, Chile was right next to China. And Lovely was in this very difficult situation where she understood everything that the Chinese were saying, but she didn't know whether she should let them know that she understood what they were saying. And so the dilemma was, should she acknowledge to them her proficiency in Chinese, or should she just be silent and observe? And I encouraged her to be silent. And in fact, she took that advice. And as a consequence, I think she enjoyed the experience that few diplomats will get to have, and that is to outsmart an entire delegation, particularly one as savvy as China. That unusual foray by a graduate student into NPT diplomacy, I think, was just an indication that Lovely was a very special person. While she was still a student at MIS, she won the State Department's top prize in the new Innovation in Arms Control Challenge. Not only did she win this competition, but she beat out a large number of much more senior faculty members from different universities around the United States. Interestingly, with her, with a focus on creating Bombshelltoe, which in fact has proved to be a ongoing interest of hers. But it was really the start of that initiative in that State Department competition. After graduating from Ms. Lovely served as a program manager at the U.S. Department of Energy's Office of Nonproliferation Arms Control, spent approximately 3 years managing the nuclear security portfolio at the Stimson Center, a think tank in Washington, D.C., and continues now in a non-resident fellow capacity at Stimson, while also continuing to work as the chief creative producer for Bombshelltoe. So I could say a lot more about Lovely, although she is indeed young. She has a large resume, but I think rather than my telling you about her, I'll let her talk to you. And so let me simply say it's a great honor and privilege, Lovely, to welcome you back into the CNS fold, even if it's just for this evening. And I look forward to your remarks. So please, the virtual floor is yours.
All right. Hello, everyone. Hopefully you can hear me all right. Thank you for everyone's time and attention, especially on a Friday or maybe even a Saturday for some of you. I want to honor your presence, and hopefully my presentation will live up to that. I'm incredibly grateful to Masako's invitation for me to do this talk, and to Dr. Potter. And I'm sorry, you'll always be going to be Dr. Potter to me for such a wonderful introduction. And I know I can't physically be in Monterey, but this event feels a bit like a homecoming because my nuclear policy career really blossomed under the support, mentorship, and camaraderie of so many CNS and Monterey faculty and peers. So with that said, I understand that the Critical Issues Forum is really here to connect students like yourself with a majority of high school students in this virtual setting with successful diplomats and policy experts in order to introduce you all to the world of nuclear policy, right? Non-proliferation, arms control, and disarmament. But given that I'm the first speaker of this series, I want to spend some time sort of describing my journey into the field. I recognize that it can be intimidating to meet a professional and dive right into the topic. So maybe, it might be the case that for some of you, you are intrigued by the notion of studying or working on international security, but not necessarily understand how to actualize or practice that interest. So I want to begin by offering what it was like for me to find out about this field, to choose it as a profession and to stick with it, since this path was not intuitive to me, if I may be honest. So I really see our time together, less of a lecture and more as a casual conversation and guardrails for the high school students here, so that as you meet more experts, you become more comfortable just having candid discussions with them. And I also understand that there are non-American students here. So, as I'm talking about some of my life experiences, even though we may have cultural differences, I hope that there are still areas that can apply to you. So instead of just going linear trajectory, telling you my life story, I actually want to open with a quote from Ocean Vuong, who is one of my favorite American writers. He's done poetry and published best-selling books. And in a recent interview, this author, Ocean, he said that the saying, "the future is in your hands," is kind of misleading because really it should be "the future is in your mouth," because you have to think and articulate the future before you can begin building it with your hands. And it's a very simple observation, but it resonated with me because as a child of Filipino-American immigrants in Los Angeles, a family that comes from humble means and limited resources, I subconsciously had a limited view of what that future could be. I did not really dare imagine traveling the world or becoming a diplomat or presenting in conferences that had hundreds of people, because it seemed that that kind of life just does not apply to mine. And one of the first things that I had to do when I was in your stage of life, high school and early college, to get on the track that eventually led me to become a nuclear policy analyst, I had to be brave enough to imagine a future where I can actually do this kind of work. And it has to start in a belief in yourself, despite the amount of resources you may have or the limitations you or your family may have. And that ability to imagine infinite futures for yourself will give you the confidence to start trying things, and will serve as a compass throughout your life. And I know this probably sounds incredibly cheesy or dramatic, but I think it needs to be said, especially right now when the world feels isolated and uncertain in a way that seems to threaten all the possibilities of what you can be. So as you continue your journey with CIF, I really challenge you to actively think about yourself doing the work of diplomats and professors and policy analysts. And it's not just about storing all of that information in your head, but really owning that possible identity for you to learn and add and represent this kind of information in the future. And so, as I mentioned, I'm first generation Filipino American. I grew up in Manila and immigrated to Los Angeles. And I just want to emphasize that I didn't grow up learning or caring about nuclear issues. I didn't have any personal tie or interest in this topic at that early age. And as an aside, there was a point when the Philippines tried to pursue nuclear energy in the 80s before I was born, but that did not materialize into a meaningful program. So it wasn't part of the public consciousness. And then growing up in the United States in the late 90s, early 2000s, I watched September 11 on TV. And so my understanding of national security at that time was primarily framed as a terrorism issue, with not a lot of emphasis on nuclear weapons. But in my early college years, a professor introduced me to the issue by way of history. So learning about all the different countries that pursued nuclear weapons and the cultural and political reasons behind their decisions. And that human factor was what really won me over to pursue this work. I cared about the people who were harmed by nuclear weapons. And at that time, it was really understanding, the environmental and health effects after the Hiroshima and Nagasaki bombings of 1945. And I also wanted to understand why certain scientists and politicians did what they did. And I didn't know all of the theories or science, but I was very interested in the stories about the bomb and how they essentially affected humanity. And the more that I researched, and really I have to note Monterey is critical here in being or serving as a foundation of my knowledge when I ended up going to Monterey for graduate school. I became especially interested in a branch of this field called nuclear nonproliferation. So how to prevent the creation of more nuclear weapons in this world by protecting materials that could end up being developed into these types of weapons. And I think most people take for granted the different ingredients or parts that contribute to a nuclear weapon. We have been trained to just think about the bomb as a finished product. Again, just thinking about how my family and friends would explain nuclear weapons to me, it's usually a reference to the Manhattan Project and the bomb just exists, and it doesn't necessarily talk about or refer to the different components that make the bomb that come from other places. And we can call these things dual use items, right? A certain technology, may they be valves or pipes that can be used in sometimes ordinary ways can actually end up being used to create nuclear weapons. So I was fascinated with that. And so a lot of my policy expertise ended up being in that particular area of this field. And I had a great fortune, as Dr. Potter said earlier, to work for the US government for about 4 years, traveling the world, talking to different policymakers and scientists, working with them to better secure these highly sensitive materials. And I want to emphasize that in this stage of my career, I wasn't a nuclear engineer or physicist. I only had policy knowledge, and I was fairly young too. I was in my mid-20s when I ended up in government. But I learned the technical side on the job, since it required me to work closely with scientists. And I think this goes back to what I said earlier about imagining yourself in these situations. I could have easily told myself, I don't have the technical background, it'll be too hard, this isn't really my forte. But instead, I told myself that I have to be in these rooms and participate in these conversations in order to see how it's really done. And again, I think I was amazed by the multitude, the many different stories that nuclear issues can hold. You know, for example, when I was talking to a nuclear power plant operator in Canada, you know, nuclear for them was a story about trust. For example, how can we demonstrate to the public that they are keeping their power plants safe and secure? When I go to Jamaica, the conversation there is about science, the use of nuclear material to conduct research so that they can find toxins on their ground. And you know, they want to be able to use certain radioactive sources in secure ways to do experiments that will help with their environment. And, you know, Dr. Potter already mentioned this earlier, you know, talking to a diplomat in Vienna, it becomes a story about strategy and history. You know, who said what during last year's conference? And are they going to change their stance on peaceful uses of nuclear material? And maybe even argue about what peaceful uses mean. And of course, you know, these stories have technical and policy details behind them, but they are fascinating stories nonetheless, and really illuminates what it means to live in a complicated nuclear world. And so now I'd go home to my parents back in Los Angeles, or try to talk to my friends about it, because I'm so excited about all of these stories that I've, you know, listened to and accumulated over time. And they would look at me with sort of a blank face and say, what are you talking about? Nuclear, what? You know, I don't understand what I can't relate. And that's when I realized that I've gained so much valuable expertise in this issue. Yet so many people outside of this space really don't understand or appreciate its significance, because there isn't a lot of available resources that would allow, you know, just everyday citizens to understand this topic. There was a wide knowledge gap. And so that's when the creative part of what I do started to kick in, because one of the things that I did in my early years in Los Angeles was creative writing. I would write poetry. I was fortunate enough to be encouraged by my family to share my poetry, to share my creative writing pieces to others through spoken word events and so forth. And so I've always had that part of me that I never really wanted to leave behind. But for the past, you know, at that point, perhaps like 5 years pursuing nuclear policy, I've had to push on the sidelines. And that's when I realized that perhaps in this case, art can be a conduit in being able to decrease that knowledge gap, to actually share the stories that I've learned throughout my experience as a nuclear expert, to the wider public, because I think it is a civic duty, a civic service to understand the sensitivity of these types of materials and the fact that nuclear weapons still exist in this world. And since she's in the crowd, I do want to give a shout out to Sayaka, who was a classmate of mine at Monterey. And she and I had one of the first conversations that really helped me think about Bombshelltoe as an organization, because we talked about the intersection of nuclear policy and art in the context of Godzilla. So I don't know if any of the high school students here know about Godzilla's story. There's the American version, and then there's the Japanese version. And the Japanese version is actually tied to a very specific point in nuclear history when the United States tested their nuclear weapons in the Pacific Islands. And there was one particular test, the Castle Bravo nuclear test, that ended up contaminating a large swath of the area, and actually affected a Japanese fishing boat that just so happened was out to sea at that time. And so Godzilla, the Japanese version of Godzilla, is actually based on that story. And it was Sayaka who told me that story. And as someone, and at that time I was in my mid-20s, I've never seen the original Japanese Godzilla. I've only seen the American version of Godzilla. And if you recall, I don't know if any of you have followed the Godzilla movie arc recently, but that particular story is not part of the American version. And that made me realize that art, even though it in some respects you don't necessarily put nuclear and art side by side, that art can influence people's perception of issues like nuclear policy. The fact that in Japan, they use that as a way to teach and open a conversation about nuclear harm. And yet in the United States, that avenue for a conversation just doesn't exist because that wasn't part of the movie plot. And so that was one of the first seedlings of my idea for Bombshelltoe. And again, going back to the future is in your brain or the future is in your mouth, I decided to apply to that arms control challenge very early in my career. I was still at Monterey, precisely because I thought that I had a good idea, which was Bombshelltoe, and that I imagined myself getting that kind of prize equally as a senior policymaker or a think tank would. And that kind of boldness, and it could have been the case that I didn't get it, but it didn't matter to me. I just wanted to express or share my idea about exploring the intersection of arts and policy, and thought that it was valuable enough to share and apply for this prize. And because of that belief in myself, lo and behold, I actually received that prize. And that again became an added layer to my nuclear policy career and gave me the resources that originally wasn't there to really unpack the intersection of policy history through art. And I think at this point of my presentation, I just wanted to share some of the more recent works under Bombshelltoe, if that's all right. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen here. Please bear with me. Oh, I'm sorry, Masako. It says that my screen sharing capabilities are disabled.
You should be able to share.
Awesome. Okay, so I hope you can see this. So for the sake of time, I'm only going to talk about two projects under Bombshelltoe. So Bombshelltoe originally was just a website that had blog posts about different art pieces that talk about nuclear issues. And then now, 7 years later, now that I have more connections, more expertise, and more resources, I'm beginning to develop art pieces that are informed by policy research, which I think is wonderful. And through that, I'm able to also connect with artists, work alongside artists, curate these projects that are very multidisciplinary. So the first project that I want to share with you is, again, I love this idea that the word nuclear holds many different stories. And for this project, I wanted to explore what nuclear means as a story about land. And here we go. And this project is called Ways of Knowing, which is a partnership with historians, with artists, as well as community members in the Navajo reservation, explaining the uranium mining that occurred in their lands that contributed to the production of nuclear weapons in the United States. And this mining occurred from, 1940s, late 1940s until the mid 1960s. But on the earlier years, a lot of that uranium, instead of going to nuclear energy, went to activities related to national security. And we can only guess what that means. But in any case, this was an exploration of something that I didn't really learn during my time in government or even in my studies, because there aren't a lot of resources about the lived experience of communities that have suffered from nuclear harm. And these are just pictures that we've taken in various sites of Navajo Nation. And what you're looking at, like, this is a mill tailings site in Shiprock, New Mexico. And we talked to a lot of activists, a lot of Native scholars about how the land has essentially been not only harmed, but continue to be harmed in ways that the community wants to see it heal. Given that, after they mined uranium in these lands, about 528 abandoned uranium mines continue to exist. During the Obama years, the US government tried to commit cleaning up at least 200 or 300 of these 500 plus abandoned uranium mines. But that has been such an arduous or just complicated project. Environmental remediation to clean up uranium contamination is just incredibly difficult. And it's also really difficult to get a sense of accountability, because a lot of the mining companies back in the day have switched names or don't exist anymore. And so even though I, as a nuclear policy expert, have a lot of the knowledge that I learned at Monterey and DC and traveling the world, I wanted to come back home. I wanted to come back home and understand from frontline communities here in the United States how their lived experience is a form of expertise that I also needed to hear, I needed to learn from them directly. And so what you see here is actually a very special camera. So part of this creative project, we filmed a 360 VR film. And Kayla Briette is the director of this project. And believe it or not, I think Kayla is only, I want to say 23 years old. She is very experimental director based in Los Angeles. She's also a composer. And so these kinds of creative projects have actually allowed me to work with young people, which is amazing. And there are certain things that Kayla knows that I will never know in my lifetime. And I think these kinds of intersections allow us to exchange knowledge. Because of this project, I think Kayla can actually talk about nuclear issues, not necessarily like an expert, but she can now draw connections why this is important to her, and vice versa. And so these are just some pictures of what it was like working in this project. It's actually ongoing. We just received additional funding to expand this beyond the film. And the film, by the way, hopefully we'll be able to finish it by next year. COVID obviously threw, our post-production plans out the window, so to speak. And so we're still working on that. But this coming year, we hope to expand this project to include research. So we want to create a body of scholarship that brings together policy folks from Washington, D.C. and local environmental and history scholars from Navajo Nation to begin to create a repository of research that brings the global security frame with the local security frame. And just really quickly, this is a good friend of mine, Tina Garnanes. She's actually interviewed in the film. She is a US military veteran whose family in Navajo Nation have experienced a lot of health effects because her grandfather used to be a uranium miner back in the 50s and 60s. And so she has been quite generous with her stories and sharing what it's like to be a person who has a very close relationship with the word nuclear, but not in a ways that you will essentially find in policy textbooks. And so that's sort of what we want to represent in ways of knowing. And then lastly, I hope you can still see my screen here as I change. Very recently, I also worked with web designers from Ukraine, nuclear engineers. Actually, Dr. Potter, I ended up working with Karen Hogue, who is another fellow Monterey classmate on this project, as well as other artists in developing this, which is called Illuminating Radioactivity, which is very simply a website that tries to explain radiation in an interesting manner. And I think my computer might be a little slow here, so I don't know if there's like a lag in me kind of exploring the website here. But this is essentially combining creative writing, explanation of the science, and illustrations through web design to tell an interesting and layered story arc of radiation. And we're really fortunate enough that this website received several awards in the web design community. And again, I think, what's wonderful about Bombshelltoe is that I'm being exposed to these communities that I, as a nuclear expert, wouldn't think I would ever be part of. But in, creating a website, a beautiful website like this, I've had conversations with web designers, with people who are just randomly online and, would tell me, I never really thought about radiation in this way. I'm not going to go through the entire website because it's my connection is fairly slow, but in it, I talk about movies that sort of instilled fear in us as we think of radiation, talk about scientists that contributed to the discovery of radiation. I touch on Fukushima, as well as the Nevada test site. So it's all of these different storylines about the word nuclear and radiation just in one site. And I think only in a creative and artful way that's possible. And I just really appreciate this exercise as a policy expert, because I'm sometimes trained to just unload all of the information that I know, as opposed to really dialing it down to really choosing what is important, what would be interesting, to be an entry point for other people who are not part of the field to take interest. So I think with that, I'm actually going to stop, because I'm cognizant of the time, and I know that we want to have Q&A. So I would just love to hear from the students any questions regarding my time in Vienna or my my work in Bombshelltoe. I guess the last thing that I will say is that right now I'm in a very new journey in my career, in that I'm actually trying to hold both worlds. I'm trying to continue my hard technical policy research related to nuclear security and nonproliferation as part of a think tank and being a consultant for a think tank in DC, but also beginning to create these art pieces with other artists and creatives through Bombshelltoe, which again, being sort of a blog back in 2013, is now an actual fully functioning organization and arts collective. But yeah, I will stop sharing my screen and just talk to you all. Thank you so much, and hopefully you found that interesting and informative.
Great. Thank you so much, Lovely. It was really amazing. So if you have a question, could you please type your question in chat box, or if you want to speak up, raise your hand. And we have lots of students. And if possible, could you activate your video when you during the Q&A session? I'm not going to force you to activate your video, but if you possible, it's great to see your face if possible. Yeah, so any question? You can ask anything. You don't need to ask question related to nuclear issues. And if students are kind of shy to ask, maybe teachers can also, if teachers have any question. Yeah, so maybe while we are waiting, maybe Lovely, do you have some specific advice for high school students who are still, exploring a lot of things? And
I do actually, yeah. And I think someone just asked a question, how can high school students be involved? Okay, so first of all, to your question, Masako, about what high school students can do now. And this is more of a general advice, but I would actually say that take advantage of this time to write well. I think that writing, maybe creative writing, policy writing, that is the one skill that I'm able to not only carry forward to my college years, but also improve upon as I go. One of the essential responsibilities as a nuclear policy expert is being able to communicate your findings, being able to communicate and relate your work to other people. And one of the ways that we do that is writing up our work, may that be a 60-page report or a 500-word opinion piece. And so writing has been incredibly valuable to my career. And I think that it doesn't have to be homework. And this is where a lot of my creative passions really helped, because through writing, I'm able to also develop my own voice when I'm writing. And I think that it just becomes more personal that way. But I think it can be hard if you try to write when you're actually, working, as opposed to just cultivating that earlier on and actually refining those I think are two different ways of approaching it. And I'd just advise that you start earlier. Okay, so the question about how high school students can get involved in Bombshelltoe. So I have, I'll put up my website link to the actual arts collective on the chat in just a bit, but there is a join the collective sheet that you can fill out. And I am actually really interested in working with younger people, because in the 10 years of my career, I am just surrounded by people my age or older. And I think that one of the challenges for the nuclear policy community is relating to the next generation, and not so much as just technology, but just the way that you think is completely, even though I am only in my early 30s, it's already vastly different from like how, you know, a young high school person thinks or believes what is true. You know, there's just so many other challenges. And I think that in order to keep the nuclear policy community alive, we have to understand the mindset of the younger generation. And so again, one of the best ways to do that in a fluid, organic manner, I think, is through art, and using art as a way to bring people who may not necessarily have anything in common together. So yes, please be in touch through Bombshelltoe. I'll also put out my email on the chat if you want to just talk to me, and I welcome any kind of programming or any kind of projects, even guest speaking again, or talking to you one-on-one about your interests. Totally happy to do that. Do you ever struggle with creative block? Yes, absolutely. It will never go away. There's a joke, especially if you're a writer, you know, when you sit down and let's say you block 3 hours of your day writing, you know, 2 hours and 30 minutes of that is just staring at a blank page and agonizing as to how to start. And maybe you'll actually get to the writing part the last 30 minutes. That's sort of really the trials and tribulations of someone who's creative. But I think over time, the way that I get through it is actually having forgiving myself to make mistakes, and just allowing myself to just dump everything that it's in my head, even though it's unpolished, unrefined, doesn't make sense. I just put it on, you know, a piece of paper or on, you know, my computer anyway, so that at least I'm able to unload that. And in the process of unloading my thoughts, I'm, you know, organically beginning to start, you know, making connections as to actually what will be the meat of my project. I was actually just talking to a writer earlier this morning, and she actually calls it a preamble. She would write a preamble of a written article first, knowing full well that she might not use it in the finished piece. Like, it's just her way of just getting it out. And to me, that was really helpful to hear, especially from someone who's written 2 books and have written on the LA Times and the New Yorker, because I sometimes feel like everything that I have to put out has to be perfect right off the bat. And just being reminded that even professionals who write for a living or do art for a living have rough drafts is really comforting. What is your future plan of nuclear disarmament activities? That's actually a really great idea. So one of the projects that I'm working on right now under Bombshelltoe, it's still in its beginning stages, is it's called Bloom. which is a project about the flowers and plants and landscapes that are attached to the histories of nuclear weapons. And I essentially want to share the story of nuclear weapons from the perspective of resilience and regeneration, as opposed to the destruction and the fear. And not to say that that isn't important. It absolutely is. But I think, again, just thinking back to the way that I learned about nuclear weapons, it's usually, a three sentences about the end of World War II. And that's pretty much it. And then I didn't touch it until, again, my professor in undergraduate really sat me down and taught me nuclear policy. So there was this huge gap where I learned it in high school in a history textbook. And then if I didn't go to the school I went to and didn't meet that professor, that may have been the culmination of my nuclear knowledge. And so I'm really interested in creating resources that's geared towards middle school, high school, early college students that pair that much more linear textbook history about nuclear weapons with issues about resilience, survival from the perspective of survivors, but in particular, these plants. And I think that through this project, I also want to begin unpacking the overlap between nuclear disarmament, achieving a nuclear-free world, and what it means to take care of land, environmental stewardship, environmental justice, and really creating a better connection with the two. Again, I can't say much more because it's still really half-baked. Again, it's in that rough draft process. I might throw away some of the elements that I'm already working on, but that's okay. But stay tuned for that, because hopefully the first parts of the Bloom project will come out next year. And then Masako, hopefully it's okay for me to just continue reading through the chat.
Yeah, please go ahead.
Okay. So, sorry, okay, as a nuclear expert, why do you think elected leaders and voters do not talk about the threat of nuclear weapons posed to climate chaos and climate justice? Most citizens know that driving gas vehicles and deforestation contribute to climate change, but do not seem vocally against nuclear weapons, even though nuclear winter could dramatically escalate climate chaos. That's a wonderful point. Actually, I was just talking about this yesterday because I had an event about nuclear security and flowers and landscapes. It's called Atomic Terrain. If you guys are interested, I'll share with you the recording of that event. But so I would say that part of the issue here is that when we talk about the intersection of nuclear and the environment, it gets easily stuck in the conversation about the nuclear energy and whether it's green or sustainable. And while that's incredibly important, and we need to discuss that, at the same time that it's a very narrow or singular angle, right? What I'm really interested in is, as you saw in my presentation of ways of knowing, that the existence of nuclear weapon has already affected land and has already ties to the environment. And so we don't necessarily have to talk about nuclear energy alone. We can talk about existing nuclear arsenals and how, that history, really the bedrock of that history is exploitation of land. And that's just, again, not part of our cultural consciousness. Again, when we think about nuclear weapons, of course, this is from the perspective of an American. a lot of people are exposed to stories of the Manhattan Project. A lot of what is or who is centered are the scientists, Oppenheimer, Einstein, Bohr, the politicians, Eisenhower, Stimson. But it's not necessarily about the characters of the land, where the mining is happening. One of the formative books that helped me as I was developing ways of knowing is called Wastelanding by Dr. Tracy Voiles. And in that book, she talks about how a lot of these scientists who created the first nuclear weapons in the United States, when they saw the American Southwest, a lot of the assumptions was it's barren land. No one was living there. I mean, it's deserted, but that's not true. Navajo peoples are there. They're actually nomadic. There was a point where a lot of their goat or sheep sort of farming or grazing pathways, they just moved around a lot. And so there wasn't a concentrated population in one given place. And obviously with the arid conditions in the American Southwest, it's very difficult to settle in that way. But from that perspective, it just looked like no one was there. And I find that a very interesting history that we don't talk about. And I know this, I want to go back to the question, because again, I think when we hear nuclear and the environment, it's just talking about future nuclear power plants. And I want to make space to talk about existing nuclear weapons, because we wouldn't have nuclear weapons without the uranium that we found deep in the ground. And I think that there's a lot of material there, a lot of discussion that we can have to weave that story into the conversation so that it becomes something that we can talk about during, presidential debates. We're just not there yet. We haven't done that work of presenting these stories, this information, so that it's in the public consciousness.
Maybe last question. I think.
Oh yeah, sorry.
No, it's okay. No, because I want to continue forever, but but I think this question is from a student. So could you address this question from Neil?
Okay.
Yeah.
So I'm going to read it real quick.
Yeah, please.
So why do you think nuclear weapons, arms control, and the risk of nuclear war at large get so little attention from voters and politicians? Sure, a handful of things like the NFU bill get proposed, but at the same time, for example, I don't remember things like New START extension getting any attention in the presidential debates. Okay, wonderful question. And I think it goes back to the lack of public consciousness about this issue, because there's so many other things happening in the world, including climate change. In the United States, there's misinformation and disinformation. I think our understanding of the security landscape, not only in the United States, but also geopolitically, is changing. And nuclear issues don't fit really well in that narrative right now. And I think that's why it doesn't raise as an issue, because there's so many other urgent issues right now. Coronavirus, pandemic, it's so hard to think about an imagined nuclear catastrophe when we as humanity haven't solved the current biological, catastrophe that we're living in right now. It's just really difficult to handle or hold all these multiple crises at once. I would say that, again, this is really the responsibility of the nuclear policy community. We have to do a better job of connecting ourselves with those issues. And I'm doing that by trying to find a better way to connect nuclear policy with climate change. That line, that connecting point exists, but I haven't seen a compelling articulation or explanation of that. I'm interested in, and this is something I also talk about during my talk yesterday, I'm interested in looking at nuclear and disarmament verification initiatives and pairing that with environmental remediation initiatives. Again, going back to the Bloom project, right? Sunflowers were a big symbol in that they planted sunflowers in Ukraine when they were decommissioning one of the former nuclear or Soviet nuclear silos, I think, in Ukraine. And I'm really interested in like, how can we actually do that moving forward in a much more intentional manner? Once we actually start talking about verification, can we have an additional layer that goes back to the environment, specifically communities that have been harmed by nuclear weapons historically? So that's sort of the research part of Bombshelltoe. I'm creating these art pieces that present the story, but I still want to work with nuclear policy analysts and technology experts to figure out, okay, how can we actually practice what we mean by connecting nuclear security with environmental issues? I think I'll stop there. I'm so sorry I went over time, but hopefully that was fascinating and that I made sense.
That's wonderful. Thank you so much, Lovely. And we could continue this discussion for maybe tomorrow morning, but I'm mindful about everybody's time. You know, it's a Friday evening and the East Coast, it's going to be a little bit late. And I know someone from Nigeria is also joining and waking up 1 a.m. in the morning, and Russia at super early in the morning. And I really would like to express my sincere appreciation to Lovely for giving a wonderful talk, and also participant. Each one of you, thank you so much for joining this event. And this is wonderful. So we really would like to continue this like a speakers series. So thank you so much, everybody. Thank you.
Thank you. Have a good night. Please be in touch. Thank you.